The property had always been quiet, a stretch of green on the outskirts of a semi-rural neighborhood where most people minded their own business. The land was old, marked by mature oaks that stood like silent guardians, their branches reaching over the boundary line that separated my lot from the neighbors. For years, I believed the people living next door understood the respect that came with shared borders. But that belief shattered the morning I discovered the first stump. At first, it didn't seem real. The tree that once shaded the corner of my yard, an oak older than the house itself, was reduced to a raw, fresh stump. The cut was clean, made by professional equipment, not a storm or natural fall. The air still carried the sting of sap, and piles of sawdust lay scattered like a warning. But the shock didn't fully settle until I looked across the line and saw the neighbor's yard unusually clear, the tree trunks neatly stacked on his side as if he had been preparing for this for days. The neighbor, a man who carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the rules applied to everyone but him, had moved in only a year earlier. From the moment he arrived, there had been signs, the constant surveying of the boundary line, the remarks about how uneven the property shapes were, and his obsession with expanding his yard's usable space. He walked around with a tape measure more than he walked around with common sense. Still, I never imagined he would take action on something he didn't own. The second stump proved it wasn't a mistake. 2 trees, both on my land, both taken without permission. I felt the first wave of dread, followed by the rising heat of anger. The trees weren't just decorative, they were part of my property value, part of the land survey that defined legal ownership, and a critical piece of the natural barrier between our lots. Removing them wasn't just rude, it was illegal. And yet, he acted as if he had every right. As I inspected the area, the ground told a story of deliberate trespass. Deep tire tracks marked where heavy machinery had crossed into my yard. The soil was disturbed as if the roots had been forcibly dragged. The more I studied, the more obvious it became that this wasn't a simple boundary misunderstanding. This was a calculated attempt to erase the natural markers that made the property line clear. By removing them, he could claim the land looked unused or unclear, a tactic people sometimes use to later argue that part of the yard was theirs by default. The thought chilled me, he wasn't just cutting trees. He was trying to steal land. Over the next day, I began noticing the subtle changes he made. Stakes appeared several feet into my property, pushed into the soil as if he were marking out a future fence. A pile of lumber had been delivered to his driveway, too large for simple repairs. It looked like the framework of a boundary fence, one that would conveniently shift the border in his favor. Still, he acted with a boldness that suggested he thought no one would challenge him. I documented everything. Every stump, every new stake, every tire mark. The camera roll on my phone filled with evidence. The land survey I kept in a drawer was pulled out, studied, and photographed. I knew this was going to escalate, and I refused to be unprepared. The neighborhood was small enough that word spread quickly. Some residents whispered their sympathy, others admitted they had seen him pacing near the property line days before the trees came down. A few hinted that he had a habit of bending rules wherever he lived. But no one expected he would attempt something this blatant. Some even warned me that confronting him would only make him push harder. That warning proved true sooner than I expected. The following morning, he began clearing brush dangerously close to the remaining oaks, trees still entirely on my property. Watching him move like he owned the space felt like a slow invasion. He didn't acknowledge that he was overstepping, he didn't pause when I approached the boundary or when I recorded his actions. If anything, he seemed emboldened by the fact that the first 2 trees were already gone. As if the irreversible damage gave him momentum. His actions grew bolder by the hour. He hired a crew, men who likely had no idea they were about to trespass. Machinery rolled toward the last few trees as if preparing for another round of cutting. At that moment, it became clear that the situation had grown beyond a neighborly dispute. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a land grab in progress. And he believed he would get away with it. But the one thing he hadn't counted on was the state's strict laws protecting trees and private property. In many places, removing trees from someone else's land could result not only in restitution costs but multiplied punitive damages, sometimes 3 times the appraised value of each tree. It wasn't just vandalism, it was financial devastation waiting to happen. By the time the local authorities arrived in response to my report, the neighbor had already cut a path through brush that was unmistakably on my land. The officers took one look at the fresh stumps and the machinery tracks and knew this wasn't a small disagreement. They documented the scene, noted the exact coordinates of the trees, and examined the land survey I provided. The neighbor, however, insisted the trees were on his side. His confidence was unsettling, as if he believed that repeating a lie loudly enough made it true. But the survey told another story, a factual, measurable, legal one. The officers informed him that a formal investigation would follow, one that included a professional land surveyor and potential charges. The moment they left, his expression shifted from arrogance to panic. He had expected a dispute, not a legal storm. And certainly not the kind that carried 6-figure penalties for tree removal alone. But this was only the beginning. Because the trees he cut weren't ordinary. They were old-growth hardwood, protected by state law, and each valued at several $1,000s. Multiply that value by the legal penalties for unauthorized removal, and the total damage was already climbing toward devastating levels. I had a feeling he still didn't grasp how severe his mistake was. But he would. Soon. As I stood in my yard that evening, staring at the empty spaces where 2 ancient trees once stood, I knew the real battle was only beginning. The neighbor had crossed a line, literally and legally, and the consequences were about to unfold in a way he never anticipated. The stakes were no longer about boundaries. They were about justice. The days following the initial report unfolded with a tension that hovered over the neighborhood like a gathering storm. The air felt heavier, the silence sharper, and every step near the property line carried the weight of what had already been lost. The neighbor had retreated into a defensive posture, watching every movement from behind his windows as if bracing for impact. But he still carried a lingering arrogance, the kind born from believing he could manipulate the situation to his advantage. He had underestimated 2 things, the law, and the truth that lay beneath the soil he had disturbed. The county dispatched an official land surveyor within the week. Unlike the casual measurements neighbors sometimes took with tape and guesswork, this survey was methodical and precise. The surveyor arrived with specialized equipment, GPS columns, boundary stakes, and documents that traced the property lines back decades. His presence alone shifted the atmosphere. This was no longer an argument between neighbors, it was an investigation with legal weight behind it. The surveyor spent hours walking the property, cross-referencing measurements, and marking the true boundary lines with bright flags. Each new flag drove a deeper wedge into the neighbor's claims. One by one, the markers formed a clear path that traced exactly where my property began and ended. And as the line emerged, a stunning truth revealed itself. The neighbor hadn't simply crossed into my land, he had encroached several feet beyond the legal boundary with the tree cutting, the machinery tracks, and the stakes he had hammered in. The surveyor's report left no room for interpretation. The 2 trees cut were unquestionably on my property. The brush clearing extended even deeper. The proposed fence line the neighbor had started marking would have illegally absorbed nearly 12 feet of my land into his yard. It was a deliberate attempt, not an accidental miscalculation. With the survey completed, the authorities returned. This time, they came with the documentation to back their warnings with consequences. They walked the line with the neighbor, showing him the markers, pointing out the damage, and informing him that the investigation was now transitioning into a formal case. Trespassing. Property destruction. Timber theft. Land encroachment. Each carried weight, but together they formed a legal avalanche he couldn't dodge. The neighbor's composure cracked. The confidence that once carried him through his reckless decisions faded into visible frustration. He argued, paced, and gestured wildly at the trees, claiming the land had always felt uneven, that the yard shapes were confusing, that the previous owners had misled him. But the law didn't care about feelings or impressions. It cared about coordinates, documents, and facts that were now undeniably against him. By the second week, the case had expanded. A forestry appraiser arrived, a specialist who examined the remaining tree stumps, calculating their age, species, and market value. The appraiser moved with clinical precision, measuring diameters, studying growth rings, and referencing state pricing tables. His final report was staggering. The combined value of the removed trees exceeded tens of thousands of dollars. But that was only the beginning. State law mandated triple damages for unauthorized tree removal. The appraisal, multiplied by 3, pushed the total into 6 figures. And that didn't include the additional penalties for trespassing, land disturbance, and environmental harm. By the time the numbers were compiled into a single document, the estimate hovered around the $300,000 mark. A number too large for the neighbor to ignore, deny, or argue away. The ramifications rippled beyond our properties. The HOA, previously silent, stepped in once they realized the situation threatened the neighborhood's image and introduced liability concerns. They issued their own notices to the neighbor. Citations for unapproved tree removal, violation of community landscaping rules, and the unauthorized attempt to adjust property lines. It was the kind of attention he had never expected, let alone prepared for. But while the legal pressure mounted, the neighbor attempted one final tactic: public manipulation. He began circulating complaints, framing himself as a victim of overreaching regulations and claiming the boundary lines had never been clear. He spoke loudly at HOA meetings, trying to rally sympathy. But the evidence contradicted every word. Residents who once doubted or avoided the situation now watched with increasing clarity. The more he tried to twist the story, the deeper he buried himself. His frustration morphed into panic. He removed the stakes he had driven into my land, but the gesture was meaningless. The records had already captured everything. He attempted to negotiate privately, offering vague promises of fixing things if I would drop the case. But his offers lacked sincerity, responsibility, or understanding of the financial magnitude of what he had caused. The county's next step was unavoidable. A formal notice of liability. The document arrived on a quiet afternoon, delivered in a sealed envelope that required a signature. From across the yard, I watched the neighbor receive it, his hands shaking slightly as he signed. He closed the door with the slow heaviness of someone beginning to grasp the reality of the situation. Behind that door, he would read the full breakdown of the damages, the violations, and the legal consequences. The figure that stared back at him was life-altering. He had crossed a boundary, literally and financially. And now he owed nearly $300,000 in damages, penalties, and costs. But the most devastating part wasn't the money. It was the irreversible documentation of his intent. The investigators had traced his actions step by step, confirming that the tree removal wasn't accidental. The illegal stakes weren't a mistake. The attempted fence line was premeditated. It painted a picture not of confusion but of calculated greed. And that narrative, backed by professional assessments, made his defense nearly impossible. The story spread far beyond the neighborhood. Word reached local media, capturing attention as another example of property line disputes escalating into staggering financial consequences. Homeowners across the region took it as a cautionary tale. People discussed how quickly a single decision, cutting trees without checking a boundary, could destroy someone financially. Meanwhile, the case moved toward resolution, but the neighbor's situation worsened week by week. His attempts to downplay the incident dissolved. His arguments against the survey failed. His complaints against the HOA were dismissed. And as the investigation neared completion, it became clear that the hammer of accountability was about to fall harder than he ever imagined. But the fallout didn't end with the preliminary damages. The most revealing evidence, the part of the investigation that would uncover his true motive, hadn't surfaced yet. And Chapter 3 would expose everything he tried to hide, leading to the final outcome he could no longer escape. As the investigation progressed, the neighbor's life became a study in unraveling confidence. He had entered the situation armed with arrogance, convinced his version of the boundary line would triumph simply because he believed in it strongly enough. But now, the evidence towered against him like a wall he could neither climb nor deny. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the most damning discovery had yet to surface. The county extended the investigation to include past records of the property, ensuring every portion of the boundary had remained consistent through previous sales and surveys. This step, intended as routine verification, uncovered something that shifted the entire case from reckless trespass to intentional deception. Buried within the county's archives was a permit application filed under the neighbor's name, a request for tree removal submitted months earlier. The document stated he intended to clear several, dead or hazardous, trees that were supposedly threatening his home. The problem was that the trees listed on the form matched the exact ones he had cut, trees that were, by the county's own environmental reports, located fully on my property. The discovery was not only incriminating, it was decisive. It proved that he had researched the trees long before taking action. It showed he had knowingly misrepresented ownership to secure official permission he had no right to. And worst of all, it confirmed that his cutting was not an impulsive boundary mistake but a calculated attempt to claim land by removing its natural markers. With this evidence, the county reclassified the case. What had once been investigated as property damage now included elements of fraud and willful misrepresentation. The neighbor's situation, already spiraling, took a sharp downturn. The new charges intensified the financial penalties and expanded his liability. The county prepared to levy civil fines that added tens of thousands more to the growing total. The HOA, eager to distance the neighborhood from the scandal, enacted their own measures. They issued formal violations, each carrying fines and mandatory corrective actions. They demanded restoration of the disturbed land, replacement of the removed trees with species of equal environmental value, and a full review of his compliance with community rules. The combined costs of these requirements rose into amounts that would overwhelm even a prepared homeowner, let alone someone who had not anticipated consequences this severe. By now, the neighbor had stopped attempting to present himself as the victim. He avoided public eye contact, skipped HOA meetings, and ceased his earlier habit of patrolling the boundary with measuring tape in hand. His yard, once bustling with unauthorized activity, sat still and silent. The machinery was gone, the lumber piles removed, and the stakes he had hammered into my property were long since pulled out, though the scars they left in the soil remained. The legal proceedings moved toward resolution. The county's official report, thick with documentation, was finalized. Doorway with a hollow stiffness, accepting the envelope as if it carried the sum of every mistake he had made. And in many ways, it did. The neighborhood watched from a distance as the financial strain began to reshape his life. Contractors arrived at his home, not to continue the fence he once hoped to build, but to assess the repairs and removals he was now required to complete. Landscapers measured the disturbed ground, marking spots for replanting. Environmental specialists prepared to restore what had been destroyed. Each service came with fees, deadlines, and oversight. He could no longer hide behind confidence. Every step forward became a reminder of the boundary he had crossed. Meanwhile, my property entered its own phase of restoration. New soil was brought in, the ground leveled, and preparations made for replanting trees that would take decades to reach the size of those that had been lost. The space felt different, emptier, quieter, but filled with a sense of closure rather than violation. I documented the restoration as carefully as I had documented the damage, each step a reminder that justice had prevailed. The county required the neighbor to reimburse every portion of the restoration costs. Each bill that arrived became another line in the ledger that held him accountable. He made payments slowly, begrudgingly, under strict deadlines enforced by legal agreements. The weight of the financial burden would follow him for years, long after the neighborhood had moved on from the chaos he created. Yet the most profound consequence was not financial. It was the shift in perception. The neighbor, who once strutted around with an air of superiority, now walked with the quiet caution of someone who had learned a hard lesson. His earlier attempts to manipulate boundaries, both physical and social, had collapsed under scrutiny. His reputation, once built on the image of a confident homeowner, had been replaced by the truth, someone who tried to steal what wasn't his and paid dearly for it. The neighborhood regained its peace. Conversations returned to normal topics, children played outside without the tension of ongoing conflict, and the quiet hum of daily life resumed. But the story lived on, retold as a cautionary tale of what could happen when someone tried to push boundaries too far. It became a reminder that property lines were not suggestions, and that nature itself, trees, soil, and land, carried legal and personal value. As time passed, the restored trees began to grow. Small, fragile, but full of potential. Their presence served as a symbol of recovery, resilience, and the quiet certainty that justice, when pursued with patience and evidence, eventually prevails. The neighbor's yard, once marked with plans for expansion, now remained untouched. No new fence. No cleared path. No attempt to push the line again. He had learned, through costly consequence, the true price of greed. In the end, the chapter that began with the sound of chainsaws cutting through boundary trees concluded with a simple truth. No land worth owning is worth stealing. And for the neighbor who tried, the lesson cost him $300,000, an amount he would remember for the rest of his life.